Hello, hello. Hey, chat, can you guys let me know if you can hear me? Hey, everyone. Welcome back to episode number 5 of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lecture series by John Vervaeke. So today we're going to be covering Plato and the cave, which is a really interesting one. We've mentioned this one quite a lot on our podcast in the past. We do these live streams every Monday at 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT, and the discussion is always 1 hour later. We take about a 10-15 minute intermission, and then we'll do a video discussion over Zoom with participants. And as well, Yuvi is going to be taking notes in a Google Doc that you guys can all actually participate in if you want to add notes. And that will be at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes. And as well, the Zoom link for participating in the video chat will be given during the intermission after the lecture.
And it's first come, first serve, and we try to limit the number of participants to ensure high quality and so that people aren't talking over each other. So we'll let in like 8 to 10 people, and then once it's full, won't let in any more people.
And as well, everything we've mentioned so far will be on a little scroller at the bottom of the screen. And I think we're pretty much ready to go. So we'll see you guys in the intermission or after the intermission.
Let's do this.
Welcome to the 5th episode of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Last time we talked about how the axial revolution came into Greece. We first reviewed Pythagoras, and then we concentrated especially on the figure of Socrates and the Socratic revolution. And we saw again how issues of meaning, wisdom, self-transcendence are so tightly bound up together. We took a look at Socrates, and we took a look at how he has a particular conception of wisdom in which what we find salient or relevant is closely coupled to what we find true or real. And those two things, those two concerns, what is transformative of us and what is true of the world, are meant to be held together. And this was pivotal in Socrates' method of trying to get people to realize how much all of us are so prone to having those two come uncoupled from each other, and we become subject to bullshit and to self-deception, and that a life that is beset by self-destructive behavior is not a life that's worth living. That a way to afford human flourishing is by developing the skills, the wisdom, to keep those two tightly coupled together. And Socrates was so convinced of how important this was, in fact, to making a life meaningful, that he was prepared to die for it. And as I mentioned, there was somebody who was a follower of him, who was at his trial, not present at his death, but was deeply traumatized and affected by his death. And this is, of course, Plato. Now, if Socrates was controversial, Plato is beyond even that statement. Every year there are hundreds of books written about Plato. This is why Plato is one of the foundations, not only because of his ideas, but as we'll see, there's an inexhaustibleness to Plato and his writing. We can come back to Plato. As a culture, we come back at different times and see things we did not see before that are transformative. And as individuals, myself personally, You can come back to Plato at different times of your life, and Plato speaks to you in ways he did not speak before. I want you to remember that, because I'm going to try and suggest to you that that is a better model for what we mean by something being sacred than it being filled with some kind of supernatural presence. That what makes something sacred is that it's an inexhaustible fount of insight and intelligibility that's transformative of us. And that's certainly the way many people in the ancient world read Plato. They were deeply affected by him. I would go so far as to say that Platonism, or Neoplatonism, as Vervaeke and others argue, is sort of the bedrock of Western spirituality. And we'll come back to that. Now, Plato was traumatized by the death of Socrates. It's deeply, I think, disturbing to him. Why I think that is because he keeps coming back to it and try and understand. He wanted to understand, how is it that the city he loved, the city he belonged to, Athens, could have killed this man that he admired and loved so deeply? How is it that his beloved Athens killed his beloved Socrates? Right? So, whereas Socrates had this sort of dilemma given to him by the gods, Plato has this dilemma given to him by the death of Socrates. Plato wanted to understand how people could be so foolish. And so what he's going to do is he's going to take that two worlds mythology that we talked about, the lower, less real world, and remember, it's mythological. It's not meant to be literally two worlds. But he's going to take that two worlds mythology and he's going to do something with it very different than what the Hebrews did. Remember, the Hebrews turned it into, this is where things are fallen now, but we're moving towards a future. We're progressing towards a future. So they give a historical answer to how we move from the world of illusion to the world of reality. Plato is not going to give a historical answer. He's going to give a scientific answer, because Plato is deeply influenced by the natural philosophers that we talked about last time. And what Plato is in fact going to do is he's going to create the first psychological theory in history. With Plato, you can really see the beginning not just of science, but the beginning of cognitive science. Psychology as a discipline begins in a very important sense. And I don't mean this trivially, like, oh yeah, it started with that. Plato's psychology is still currently relevant right now in important ways, which we'll talk about. So let's get into that, because this is again going to take us into these interconnected issues of meaning, wisdom, self-transcendence, altered states of consciousness, etc. I hope to show you how Plato, in trying to answer the question of how Athens could have killed Socrates, is ultimately influenced not just by Socrates, but also by Pythagoras. We know that Plato spent some time with a Pythagorean community, and he seems to have gone through some kind of training in that community. So Plato develops a particular theory about why human beings do foolish things. And there's different aspects of it, but a good way to think about it is by relating it to something that we're all familiar with. This is the experience of inner conflict. Inner conflict is when you have two strong motives that seem to be working against each other. And you can see how this is immediately going to be relevant to existential meaning, to meaning in life, because very often we feel most distraught, most anxious, or the most sense of being stuck when we have such inner conflict, when we're divided against ourselves in an important way. So here's a classic example, right? So I like chocolate. I more than like chocolate. Chocolate has a kind of deep attraction for me. So recently I lost about 20 pounds, right? So I went on a diet. Now dieting is one of the most unsuccessful things that human beings can do. The recidivism rate is 95%. Recidivism means that within a year, 95% of people who are on a diet are back to their pre-diet weight. So the diet industry has a 5% success rate, even though it makes billions of dollars. I mean, I wish I had that success rate for my job. I wish I only had to succeed at 5% and I was given millions of dollars for that kind of work. And you have to ask yourself, well, why does that work? Well, it works because of the problem. It's such a pressing problem that people will grasp and pay money in anything in the hopes that it might work. Because what's the problem? Well, the problem is, right, it goes like this. And we'll talk about the cognitive science about this. I know I should lose weight. There's the evidence. It's clear, makes rational sense to me. I should lose weight. Yes, okay, I should lose weight. And then I go home, and there sitting on the counter is some chocolate cake, right? And that doesn't quite capture, right? It's not just sitting there. It's like humming with its chocolatey goodness, right? And it's drawing me in. It's like sort of, and so you end up sort of often just eating the chocolate cake. Or another example you might be familiar with, procrastination. I know my students face this, right? Yes, I have an essay due in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, there it is. I should work on my essay tonight, because if I start now, I won't be rushed. I know if I'm not rushed, I'll do a great job. I'll have more time to research. I'll be able to change my mind. I should start working on my essay tonight. Somebody calls up, want to go out for some drinks? Yeah, and you're gone, and you procrastinate. So we are clearly beset by this inner conflict. And Plato gets this great insight. He gets the insight that there seems to be a deep connection between inner conflict and self-deception, self-destructive self-deception. So Plato posits an idea that has become, again, so natural to us that we just think, oh yeah, of course. But again, he comes up with it. Plato comes up with the idea that we have different centers in the psyche, right? And each center has a different cognitive relationship to the world and motivates us in different ways. And he represented this mythologically, right? He said, there's like a part of us that's like a man. Now, I want to say something here right now, because although Athenian democracy is horribly sexist and treats women horribly, and so remember that context, because what's intriguing is how much Plato was able to rise above that. Plato argues that women should rule as well as men, that women should be in the army as well as men. Now, he doesn't perfectly free himself, of course, from sexism, but given the context, I think it's very admirable the degree to which he was able to do it. Nevertheless, he does use this idea of a man that's in your head and represents reason. And that man is motivated by truth, what's true. So he cares about truth and falsity. That's what it cares about, right? And right, scope, right? It can go into very long-term goals. And it can deal with very abstract entities, like your health or an essay, right? Very abstract entities. So this is, health. And I should lose weight. It's going to take me several months. And I should do that because it's true that if I lose weight, my health will improve. So why don't I just do it? Well, because opposed to it, there's a monster, right? And it's sort of in my stomach and genitals, right? And it represents appetite. Now, it does not work in terms of truth and falsity. It works in terms of pleasure and pain. Very different set of norms. Now, there's nothing wrong with operating in terms of pleasure and pain. If you don't have a capacity to work in terms of pleasure and pain, you're dead. So Plato doesn't think the appetites are evil. What he wants you to grasp is that they operate according to different principles than the man. Okay, so they pursue long-term goals? No, immediate. When do you want the cake? I want it now. Now. I'm going to the party now. Right? It works in terms of very superficial properties. All I care about the cake is how it looks. It looks yummy. I don't have some in-depth analysis, right? It's just, chocolatey, sweet, yum. So very superficial. Again, that's not necessarily bad. Often, in life and death situations, a superficial appraisal is exactly what you need. I don't need to know a great deal about the inner workings of the tiger. I just need to know, oh crap, deadly, get out of here. Okay. Now notice how these are opposite to each other. Now, I put a space between here, obviously because I'm setting you up for a third thing that Plato talks about. But before I do, I want you to notice what Plato's doing with Socrates here. So Socrates didn't really have a theory, he had a practice. Socrates' practice, if you remember last time, was to get people to realize how often what they find salient is rushing ahead of what they find truthful. Do you remember that? What Plato is saying is that's not a coincidence. The reason why that happens is because we have different parts of the psyche that work this way. This makes things salient to you, really catchy, motivates you urgently right now. This is the part that you use to understand. And see, here's what most of us face. This monster is constantly racing ahead of what we understand. Do you see? What Plato is doing is it's explaining why we are so prone to bullshit, why salience often exceeds understanding. We are perpetually vulnerable. Now we'll talk about why we have this. Now, let's go back to the dieting as an example. What helps, though? There's certain strategies you can use, of course, to improve, right, how you frame things, and we'll talk about that later. But typically, what's one of the things that improves people's chances of losing weight? They join a group, like Weight Watchers, right? Or they join a study group to avoid the procrastination. Why? Well, here's an important thing. You're not just a biological creature. As I've been arguing throughout, you're also cultural. You have evolved across, you're the result of evolution that has crossed several species in which you come wired to learn about abstract symbol systems, use technologies, both physical and psychotechnologies. So you have a lot of powerful cultural, sociocultural motivations. So he compared this to a lion, because lions are social animals. They're quite and lions have been associated with sort of honor. Because that's, right? That's what this works in terms of. It works in terms of honor and shame. Right? Honor is to be respected by those you consider your peers. Shame is when you feel that you have failed to gain respect from your peers. We should not confuse shame and guilt. They are not synonyms. Right? Guilt is when you feel that you have failed to meet your own ideal of who you should be. Shame is when you have lost the capacity to get respect from your peers. Now, what's interesting is that, and this is Plato's point, this part of us can pursue sort of intermediate scope. Because we're cooperating with other people, it doesn't operate just short term, but it doesn't quite operate abstract theoretical. It works within the sociocultural domain. So it can pursue sort of mid-term goals. Not just immediate goals, but not sort of abstract symbolic goals, but socially agreed upon shared goals. And it works on sort of the cultural aspects of things, not their abstract meaning or their superficial meaning, but their cultural, their shared meaning, the way we can share it with other people. Notice how much you want to share with other people your experience. So I've been saying this for years, and I still see people doing it, even people that I've taught it to. People will reliably do this. They'll be eating something. They'll trying it for the first time, and they'll go, "Oh, this tastes horrible. Have some." They'll give it to somebody else because you want to have that, in addition to whatever immediate response you're having, you want there to be a shared cultural meaning to what's happening in your experience. And there's good reason for that because, as I've been arguing throughout, your connection to distributed cognition is one of the most powerful ways you increase your cognitive power over the world. Now, he sort of represents this as being like in the chest. And this has to do because we feel a lot of our social emotions and motivation in the chest. You know, your pride and honor and, you know, shame, right? Things like that. Now, this is problematic for us. What should go there? Because the Greek word doesn't have a direct English equivalent. Sometimes people put emotion there, that's not quite right. Sometimes people put the word spirit there. That's closer, but the problem with spirit is it has all kinds of spooky associations with it, right? I'm not going to translate it. I'm just going to leave it as is. This is your thymos. This is the part of you that is motivated socially. So, here's an interesting idea Plato has, right? There is a lot of potential conflict in this system. There's a lot of potential conflict in this system. What you want to do is get it properly ordered. Now, when you don't order it, think about what this means. Salience and understanding and participation get out of sync with each other, and then we're subject to bullshitting. We're subject to self-deception. The more inner conflict we have, the more likely we are to engage in self-deception, because these two are out of sync, and the more likely we will become very egocentric. So when people are suffering, especially inner conflict anxiety, they tend to become more self-centered, even selfish. Because when you're experiencing inner conflict, you're getting sort of a threat signal. Things aren't right. And when people are under threat, they tend to become very egocentric. Again, that's adaptive. Now, we're going to come back to this, but we want to do a little bit of cognitive science. Why do we, why? Okay, it makes sense that we have this as a motivation because we're social creatures, right? One of our greatest adaptation is our ability to cooperate together. So, you know, you throw me into the African savannah on my own and I'm dead soon because, like, I don't have great claws, I don't have great teeth. Look, what a silly structure, right? I'm teetering around on 2 feet, almost always losing my balance. I can't run quickly. Everybody can see me from a long distance because I'm towering above the grass. My throat and my vital organs are nicely exposed for any predator. This is bad. Okay? But you know what I can do? I can get together with a bunch of other human beings, and we can get some pointy sticks and some dogs, and then we can kill everything on the planet. Our ability to work together has always been adaptive. So we know why this is here. But why does this have so much more power than this? Well, there's actually an important reason. And this has to do with some work started by Ainsley and others on what's called hyperbolic discounting or temporal discounting. And what Ainsley and other people found is this pattern of behavior exists across species. It's not just something that human beings engage in. You can find it across species. It's even more universal than something like flow. It's not just universal amongst human beings. It's universal across many species. So this is a deeply adaptive mechanism. What does this mechanism look like? Okay, so this is called discounting. And this is a little bit confusing. Discounting is how much you are reducing the salience of a stimulus. The more you discount, the less salient something is, the less it stands out for you, the less it grabs your attention. This axis is time in a tense sense. This is the present, and this is the future. So what I'm showing you is what's happening to discounting, which means how much a stimulus is losing its salience. And this is what it looks like. This is what the curve looks like. Okay? So a present stimulus has a large degree of salience to it. Remember the monster? Something that's in the future, especially as it gets into the far future, much less salience to it. That's why the monster can override the man. But why? Why do we have this? Well, this is actually very, very adaptive. That's why it's a universal phenomenon. How is it adaptive? So I want you to think about doing you're about to do something here. I don't smoke. I do diet, but I don't smoke. But let's suppose I was doing this. Here's right now, and I decide to smoke a cigarette, right? And that could have one of two options, right? You know, I get a cough here, or I don't get a cough there, or something like that, right? Now, notice, and I'm doing this very simplistically. I'm not saying that whenever you do something, there's only two effects from it. I'm just doing it simplistic, in a very simple manner, so you can understand the point, okay? Now, the probability of now happening is 100% because it's happening. The probability of each one of these happening is 50%. Now, if it goes this way, then there's two more effects. The probability of each one of these is 25, right? And so on. So do you see what's happening? As you move into the future, the probability of any one of these events occurring is going down very fast. Now, here's the thing. This is actually adaptive. You should pay less attention to things that are less probable in happening. That actually makes good sense. The less probable an event is, the less attention you should give it. Imagine if you didn't have this. Imagine if you didn't screen off things that were low in probability. Think about how you would be overwhelmed by all the possibilities. So if I get out of bed, I might twist my ankle slightly. And that might slow me down getting to class. And if I slow down getting to class, that might have an impact on my mark. And that might cause me to fail my course. And then if I fail my course, that might disrupt my degree. And that might cause me to fail in my career. And then I'm going to end up in Buffalo alone, married to a lamp or something. Now that's ridiculous, right? Now it's possible. It's not impossible, except the last part. You can't really get married to a lamp. But, right? In fact, here's a hypothesis I have. Now notice the word I used, please. I think one of the things that goes wrong in people who experience generalized anxiety disorder is that this is not working well enough. It's not screening off and making low salient, low probability events. So highly anxious people find things salient that they shouldn't. They find low probability things too salient. So this is really adaptive. This is why you have it. But there's a problem with it. And this is a problem with any adaptive machine. And you're going to see later why this is the case. Okay, let's go back to the cigarette smoker. I smoke, and through a long chain, this is me dying in Hamilton. Right? This is the event of me dying in Hamilton, lung cancer in my left lung. I'm not going to write these all out. This is me dying in Hamilton of cancer in my right lung. This is me dying in Toronto, cancer left, right. This is me dying in Burlington because, so on. There's all these different deaths. Now here's the thing. Each one of those deaths has a low probability of occurring, right? You see that? Each one of those deaths has a low probability of occurring. But here's the thing about me, and I bet you I share it with you. I don't want to just avoid death in Hamilton, although that would be a particularly bad death. I don't want to avoid just dying in Hamilton. I'm from Hamilton, so I'm allowed to do that. I want to avoid death. I want to avoid all these deaths. Now, think carefully, and I'm using this very technically, but I'm speaking accurately. I want to avoid death in the abstract. I don't want to avoid this death, or this death, or this death, or this death. I want to avoid all possible deaths. I want to avoid death in the abstract. Now, here's the thing. The chance of each one of these deaths is very low. But if you pool them together, the chance that cigarette smoking will lead to a premature death is very, very high. Okay, so what does that mean for me? The hyperbolic discounting blinds me to this because it's not very probable, blinds me to this because it's not very probable, blinds me to each one of these because each individually they're not very probable. But in blinding me to each, you know what it blinds me to? What they share in common. It blinds me to what they all have in common. And what they all have in common is a premature death. By blinding me to what they have in common, what they abstractly share, this adaptive machine actually has me take another puff on the cigarette and sets me on the course towards cancer or emphysema. Do you see? Now, please remember this. This is going to be a theme we're going to be coming back to again and again and again. I mentioned it before when I talked about flow. The very machinery that makes you adaptive is the machinery that makes you prey to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Part of what meaning and wisdom have to do is they have to wrestle with that unavoidable reality. The unavoidable reality is you can't throw this away. You can't throw away this machinery, because if you throw this adaptive machinery away, you're doomed. You can't get out of bed because you're overwhelmed by crippling anxiety. You can't throw it away, but you can't just let it run untutored, because then you smoke the cigarette, you eat the cake, you go to the party, and you harm yourself in a self-deceptive, self-destructive fashion. So what do you need to do? Here's the monster. What you need, and what we developed, is we developed an ability, especially here, frontal lobe area, to form abstract thought, to abstract what is in common in the distant future and symbolically represent it to ourselves. That's what the man does. The man can grasp the abstract thought of avoiding the premature death. But you say, but the man is so weak. The man's weak because you don't want him to be able to shut this off. You want him to be able to override it, but in a very minimal sense, because that's so adaptive. See, so Plato is deeply right. So, in fact, I think Plato is so deeply right, that's why we keep discovering this division. Freud divides the psyche into these three things: the superego, the ego, the id. You know, there was a movement in the 90s in neuroscience to talk about, you know, the reptilian brain, the mammal brain, and the neocortex. We keep rediscovering this Platonic division. But Plato had an interesting idea. He said, you know what? The man can learn. The man is capable of grasping theory, abstract symbolic representation of the case. Now, the lion really isn't capable of theory, but what the lion can do is the lion can be trained. You can use your reason to train your lion. How do you do this? Well, this is where Socrates is so relevant, right? And this is why Plato writes dialogues. Because what Socrates did was he took reason into the social arena. Socrates goes into the marketplace and dialogues with people. There's this social interaction is happening. And the social interaction is being wed to rational reflection and to inspiring people to try and overcome self-deception, And so using a Socratic method, the man can train the lion. And then the man and the lion together can tame the monster. Not kill it, but tame it. And what you want is you want that teaching of the man, the training of the lion, and the taming of the monster so that something happens. You reduce as much as possible the inner conflict. So this is like, for Plato, Plato describes wisdom as an internal justice within the psyche, in which the man has been taught, the lion has been trained, and the monster has been tamed, so they can get along together as much as is possible. So this is what's known as an optimization strategy, right? If I let the monster rule, everything else shrinks to a minimum. What you want is you want the right coordination of the parts of the psyche so that each can live as much as it possibly can without putting the other two in danger. When you can get that inner harmony, that optimal relation, so each is living as much as it can without putting the other ones in danger, this mutuality of the most existence, this is, for Plato, this is to experience a fullness of being. This is to be as fully alive as you possibly can be. It is also to experience a kind of peace because your inner conflict has dropped. So this is very powerful. One of your meta drives, in addition to all the drives people have, they want to have whatever they're having without inner conflict. They want to be at peace with themselves. Now, this, of course, is a powerful meta drive that you can tap into. Because if you have a strong drive within you to get this inner justice, to realize wisdom, to get this fullness of being, then I can appeal to it. I can appeal to it Socratically. But notice that this has an important component to it. Because as I reduce inner conflict, my self-deception goes down. And as I reduce my inner conflict, I'm less egocentric. Both of these things are making me more in touch with reality. So, I'm reducing inner conflict. But the effect that's having is, right, I'm getting a clearer vision of reality because my self-deception and egocentrism is going down. Now that matters because, as we've seen before, you want to be in touch with reality. You have a meta drive. Philosophers have various thought experiments for talking about this. One I'll sometimes do with students is I'll say, imagine the following, right? You go home one day and your parents say, well, come here, I want to show you something. And you say, what? And they take you to this hallway that you've walked down 1,000 times before. And they press on a part on the wall that for you has never meant anything. And when they press, a door opens and there's a room in there and there's TV screens and there's videotape and there's pictures of you at all stages of your life. And then they say the following to you. Just before you were born, 9 months before you were born, we were hired by the government to have you. This is part of an experiment. The government gave us scripts to memorize. And we did this as a part of a government experiment. We don't actually love you or care about you at all. We've just been following the script, doing what we've been doing because the government has hired us to do this. But we're obligated now that you've turned 21 or whatever to tell you the truth. We don't care about you. Now, we still have to keep doing this. When we'll leave the room, you can forget all about this if you want. Right? And we'll just say that what we've always said. We'll tell you how much we love you. We'll make sure that your needs are met. Just know right now that none of that is how we truly feel. Okay? Now ask people, how would you feel? And they'd go, well, I'd be devastated. But I say, but nothing's changed. They're going to still say all the same words to you. they're still going to treat you exactly the same way. And what people say is, well, it's no longer real. Here's another thing I'll do with people. I'll say, how many of you are in satisfying personal relationships? Quite a few people put up their hands. And then I'll say, how many of you would want to know that your partner was cheating on you, even if that meant the destruction of your relationship? Almost everybody puts their hand up. They're willing to destroy this relationship that's giving them so much happiness because they don't want it to be fake. They want it to be real. And we'll talk later about why this need to be real is so important. But I want you to understand what Plato's talking about here. Notice that two of your most important meta drives are being met in the Platonic model. You're reducing inner conflict, and you're becoming more in touch with reality. Now that feeds on itself in an important way. I get better on picking up on real patterns in the world. My skill at picking up on real patterns is improved because I get a clearer vision, I get better at tracking real patterns, right? But what does that mean? Well, as I start to get more inner peace, I start to be able to pick up on real patterns. I get the skill, the vision ability. But of course, what I can do is I can apply that to myself. Socratic self-knowledge. As I get better at picking up on real patterns, I can apply that to myself. I can get better knowledge of myself. As I get better knowledge of myself, I can better teach the man. To be a good teacher, you have to know your student better. As I get better knowledge of myself, I can teach the man, I can better train the lion, I can better tame the monster. So notice what's happening here. I improve a little bit my skill at picking up on real patterns. I use that skill on myself to increase my self-knowledge and get better patterns, which means I reduce my inner conflict. As my inner conflict goes down, I get a clearer vision of reality. As I get a clearer vision of reality, I get better at picking up on real patterns, which means I improve my self-knowledge, which means I reduce my inner conflict. And you see what happens? This starts to spin like this. These two sides feed into each other and reinforce each other and improve each other. And this is wonderful for you because you're becoming less inner conflicted and you're coming more in contact with reality. Now, Plato has a famous story, a parable, a myth in the sense that I'm talking about in this series. It's called the parable or the myth of the cave. And it's a way of talking about this, the relationship between these things. Notice two things here. You need to remember this. Notice how much self-transformation and getting more in contact with the world are interconnected. This is participatory knowing. I'm not over here as an impartial passive observer, just forming true beliefs about this. I have to change myself in order to see the world. And then the world changes, and then that puts a demand on me to change myself. And as I change myself, the world discloses itself in a new way, and so on and so forth. This is participatory knowing. I'm not just changing my mind. This is not just knowing with my mind. This is knowing with the very machinery of myself. Now, what's Plato's myth? So here's the surface, right? There's a pathway going down, right? That leads into this inner cavern, right? There's a fire here, right? There's people chained into chairs, so all they can do is look at the back of the cave. Then there's other people walking in front of the fire, and it's casting shadows onto the cave because of the firelight, and they're hearing the echoes. And what Plato says is, people take the shadows and the echoes to be the real things because they're chained, they're caught up. But what happens is an individual gets free. And what does that individual do? That individual turns and sees the fire. And that allows them to realize that the shadows and the echoes aren't the real things. They're shadows and echoes. And what happens is the person's ability to notice the real patterns as opposed to the merely correlational patterns is changed. Remember we talked about that? People start to see, they start to realize, oh, these are what real patterns feel like, as opposed to what I thought was real. You get the taste for reality developing. And that taste means they start to look around and explore, and then they realize there's a path, there's light coming through it. And then they start a journey upward. Now, notice how this journey works. When they take a step forward, they're blinded by the light. And they have to wait. They have to wait for their eyes to adjust. The self has to be transformed. And then once the eyes have adjusted, they can see how to go. And then they take another step. And then they're blinded again. And there's this slow process. And Plato keeps talking about, at various stages they have to stop because they're blinded. And then they adjust. And then they gain the ability to see where they couldn't see before. It's this participatory transformation I talked about. And eventually they come up here. And they look around. Right? And what are they looking for? They want to see the source of the real light, the light that's making them, allowing them to pick up on the real patterns. Where is this light that shows the reality of things coming from? And not only is it showing the reality of things, this light is the source of the life of things. Where's this source of understanding and light? And if they look around, and of course they glimpse, because they can't stare at it directly, the sun. And it's overwhelming, it's beyond their comprehension. But they see it, and it fills them with a kind of awe. And of course, what they do is they go back down into the tunnel rapidly, right? And they get here and they try to tell their fellow prisoners what they saw, but of course they're stumbling around because their eyes don't work anymore in that darkness. And they're saying things that don't make absolutely no sense to these people. And so they ridicule them, and if they could, they would kill that individual. And of course, this is an allusion to Socrates. Now, first of all, notice that, contrary to what people think, enlightenment is not just an Eastern idea. This is a myth of enlightenment, of coming into the light. It's a myth of self-transcendence and self-transformation. It's a myth of coming, and I mean myth in the sense that we've been talking about. It's a parable of coming into greater and greater contact with reality. You see, notice the story is, right, you pick up on real patterns, that challenges you, it sort of blinds you, and then you transform to pick them up, and then you're enabled to move forward, then you confront those real patterns again, and you're doing that cycle that I talked about. There's a Greek word for this, ascent, called anagoge, anagogy. This is the anagogic, or the anagogical aspect of Plato's idea. Notice what he's doing. He's taking the movement between the illusory world and the real world, and he's turning it into this account of how you can make your lives rationally more meaningful. You can become more fully alive and more at peace in conjunction, in concert with you coming more and more in contact with the real patterns that make sense of reality. You can satisfy in a mutually supporting fashion your desire, your meta drive for inner peace, and your meta drive to be in contact with reality. This is what Plato calls wisdom, a fullness of being. We become more and more real ourselves as we become more and more at peace, so that we can more and more realize the real patterns. We conform ourselves more and more to reality. And you may say, this is kind of a crazy story. Is it? Is it? Because here's a story from 1999. There's all these people, and they're trapped in a world of shadows and unreality. It's called the Matrix. And they need to wake up and be welcomed to the real world. And the character that's in there is Neo, from Neoplatonism, the new man. People flock to that movie. And all it is this, with some great martial arts and some interesting science fiction special effects. This parable, this is what I mean about a myth. This isn't a story from the past, right? The reason why you go to the Matrix and people still watch it and talk about it is because it's a myth. It sings to you, it speaks to you now, because it talks about perennial problems that you face, problems of the psyche being in conflict with each other, the problem of being caught up in illusion, out of touch with reality, and it presents the possibility of liberation and self-transcendence and a fullness, an enhanced meaning in life. It's a myth of wisdom that is perennially relevant, because it's not about the past, it's about what's happening in you right here, right now. I want you to notice a couple things about this. I want you to notice first how reason and spirituality are not opposed to each other here. They're inseparably bound together. I want you to notice how Plato is putting Socrates, the Socratic project, because Socrates is how you get the man to teach the lion, how you get to realize your own foolishness, with Pythagoras. Because here's, right, the self-transcendence, the rising above yourself, the radical transformation of your consciousness and cognition that Pythagoras talks so much about. Now, this is such an entrancing and enriching and empowering myth, a perennial parable, that it's going to be a constant refrain throughout the West. People are going to be coming back to it again and again and again. And I want to talk now more about the Pythagorean side of Plato, just to bring out a few things. Right. So, Plato talks about, he uses a term, eidos, and that gets translated into the word form. And when people hear the word form, they hear shape. It also gets translated into the word idea. When they hear idea, they think of concept or an idea in your head. That's not what Plato means. When he's using that word, it's much closer to our word like a paradigm. He's using a word to talk about the real patterns that we're discovering in reality. Now, there's an interesting thing about these real patterns. They're both the access, the pathway we have to understanding something, the pathway we have for getting at the reality of something, because those are the real patterns. But they're not just the affordance of our knowing. The real patterns are also what makes something be what it is. So, This is work also from the psychology of concepts and how people understand things. When you ask people what a bird is, they'll say the following. Oh yeah, well, I know what a bird is, right? It has wings, feathers, a beak, and it flies. There you go, that's a bird. They give you what's called a feature list. And then you think that, and then you can get involved in a very long process, which I think has largely been something of a mistake. We'll come back to this. No, not totally, because it's important in science, but of thinking that the way I understand something is by having a definition of it in terms of the correct features. Now, there's a problem with this. Although people believe that this is how they know what a bird is, they're mistaken in an important sense, because I could satisfy this definition in the following way. I could put a couple wings on this table, a bunch of feathers, a beak, and then throw it all up in the air. I have wings, beak, feathers, and flight. Do I have a bird? No, I don't. I have a bloody mess. Because what's missing is something more important. What's missing is the structural, functional organization, the way all those things hang together, the way they're structured together so that the bird functions as a whole. What's missing from this is the structural, functional organization that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The Germans have a great word for this, Gestalt. In English, we don't. The Greeks have a good word for this. It's the word logos, although a word that's being discussed a lot today. I think it needs to be discussed a little bit more carefully. Now, here's the thing I want you to realize. Remember we talked about how you pick up on real patterns, and a lot of those patterns you're not picking up in explicit sense. You know what a bird is. You have some sense of the logos of it. But if I ask you, what is that logos? What is the structural functional organization? And most of what makes a bird is found in that logos. But if I ask you, what is the logos of a bird? How do these all structure together so they function as a whole, in which the whole transcends simply an accumulation of its... You can't tell me. But that's what the research shows, in fact. You can't tell me. Your grasp is intuitive. So notice something very interesting here. You often have an intuitive grasp of the logos of things. And the logos is form, where form doesn't mean shape. Form means something more like formula. It means the structural functional organization. And that form, that logos, is not only how the thing is, right, integrated together, it's how your mind can be integrated with it. Remember, this logos, this real pattern, is not only how you know something, but it's also the pattern that makes it be what it is. So this is a very different idea of knowing. You saw it already in the myth of the cave. But when I really know something, I conform to it. I become like it in some important way. I get in my mind the same real pattern that's in the thing, because that real pattern is what allows me to come to know the thing and to enter into that reciprocal realization with it. Now, this is going to be an important idea. This is an idea that's going to be taken up by Plato's greatest disciple. Somebody we're going to talk about next time when we're together, and that's Aristotle. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, guys, thanks for watching. We're going to take a short break, 11 minutes, 45 seconds, and we're going to jump back on a Zoom discussion and discuss what we just watched. So we'll give out the link pretty shortly, so stay tuned. I'll actually throw it in the chat, I think. We do a first come, first serve thing, and I think we'll fill it up around 8 to 10 people. So I'll announce that pretty quick here. I accidentally clicked stop streaming. Is that going to cause a problem?
Yeah.
Hey everyone. Hey guys.
Hello, hello. Going live here.
All right, guys, welcome. That was a good one.
That was a really good one.
I really enjoyed that. What do you guys think?
Anybody have any burning commentary? Who wants to start?
Oh, we're quiet today. All right. Well,
One thing that came up for me pretty strongly was just the hold on one sec. Sorry, I had YouTube going in the background, so I was getting some echo. Just like our capacity for self-deception, like these different like components of our psyche that are often in conflict, and we like that spoke clearly to me on like how we actually deceive ourselves. Like there's these different components of our psyche that are causing us to become confused and deceive ourselves in ways that like before I heard this, like, and it just like made it very clear for me to understand like this is how I can become easily confused. And like I've noticed with meditation that it's easier for me to see these different like actors almost playing out in myself. So
yeah.
It's really interesting because this is how even in modern psychology we still view the psyche. We see kind of these different networks that operate within the brain. Like the default mode network is what is usually called like the ego. So it's the self-referential part. And then if you shut that down in meditation, you get a completely different experience of being, because you don't have the self-referential thoughts. So we still think about it that way. And actually, I don't know if he mentions this later in the series where he talks about the Eastern approaches, but in Eastern approaches they talk about aligning your chakras, and it's the same idea. It's like they're these different aspects of your psyche that want different things, that operate in different ways, and if you get them all kind of talking to each other and in balance with each other, that's when you get wholeness.
One thing that struck me was that that process of getting to wholeness, that the way they talk about it, it really is a process where the man trains the lion to tame the monster, and it's an ongoing project that sort of works in a spiral. And how that, I feel like that that view that that psychological health is sort of, it's not a like an end state. It's a skillfulness with the machinery of relating those pieces of oneself together, which is how we achieve that health. I feel like that is starting to become more of a known view in the mainstream, but I feel like we're very much coming out of a time where we had this idea that we had to, like, the monster, Victorian times, the monster is like this evil thing that we have to suppress and get rid of somehow. And that we're moving now, I think, into this more reality-based model where, no, this is something that needs to integrate, and that our role is to mediate between these forces within ourselves instead of trying to excise them and suppress them.
Yeah, actually it relates to our commentary in the Joker movie, where he suppresses his inner monster until it explodes in a very ugly way.
We've talked about this before as well, the idea that if you think that you've built your walls so tightly around the garden that the snake can't get in, the snake will find a way in that you aren't looking. And the tighter you think you have it sealed, the higher up the chain the snake gets. So that was kind of the notion of the comments that I was making in the thread about our reasoning process is become circumvented by the monster. The monster is like slowly learns how to work its way up and grab hold of the monster and drive the monster. And so in some deep way, this reasoning capacity that we supposedly have developed over time has been used now with all of our technology to give us really hyper effective bullshit. And that's the notion of the media structure is just very well tuned to that. And even social media, all of this stuff is just, really attuned to the dopamine, to the appetite. It's really all of our reasoning capacity is all about satisfying appetite now. And I was even looking at someone recently talking about the success porn, or, self-growth porn, right? All of this stuff about the different courses that you could take and things to get better. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, am I actually getting better, or am I just getting a dopamine hit of thinking, look how much better I'm making myself?
Totally. Or spirituality porn, where people are like, I have achieved now this level, or I've had this insight, so I'm here. Therefore I'm good. I'm done.
It also, I like what Heather said too about the way that it spirals, because this kind of loops back to Don Beck and Claire Graves' spiral dynamics notion. And the chakras there seem to line up as well, right? And it actually occurred to me, it's just the beginning of a thought, so I want to play with it a little bit more. But if I think of the chakras as on or off, expressed or not expressed, and kind of going from the root all the way up to the crown, and turning on and off successively as a binary, first the root's on and everything else is off, and then the sacral is on and the root's off, and it's like it just kind of progresses through that. The interesting thing about that is the way in which things seem to accelerate. And when we get to reason, everything else has to, the process of transcend and include, the include part is kind of backfilling all of that in kind of a successive chain. So that you almost have to go back and rebuild from scratch all of the lower levels. But at the time that you get close to rebuilding it all, it's like, okay, now it's time for all of that to tilt, and we're going to go up one more level and integrate the whole thing again. Which again makes me think that this is kind of the notion of the meaning crisis. We're at a point where we're getting a very large rollover of the odometer of our chakra integration.
Yeah, this is spiral dynamics all over again, that we develop these different levels or ways of understanding the world in some sort of primary form, and then we have to go back and reintegrate them in order to move to the next level of complexity. And that keeps coming up for me, that this integration is what's needed right now in the world. We don't need to invent new things. We don't need to necessarily grow in any specific new directions. We've already developed all these different technologies externally and capacities internally. We just have to make sure that they're all talking to each other and working together properly.
You know, something really kind of simple, but to me it seems powerful. It relates to how much time I've spent training dogs. And I had a friend when we were living in Thailand who's kind of part of the royal dog trainers of Thailand. Like, they train all the king's dogs and do all the training for the security force for the airport. And he was talking to me about the perception of the dog and how it's not like you just train it, you give it a trick or give it a procedure and it just constantly does that. It's always optimizing to do it in a more energy efficient, or in other words, lazy way. It's always trying to kind of cut corners and like get the treat with the least amount of effort. And like every single lesson I learned from dog training seemed to apply to myself. It's like, if I don't have these consistent rules and I'm not consistently watching the monster always finds ways to get around what the man or the lion are kind of setting down as a rule set. And that if I'm not vigilant on that level, but it's not even about vigilance in every way. It's a lot of it's about habit. Like, if I don't just kind of make it a routine, make it almost a mechanical process of like correcting the monster every time it steps out of line, then it's like, then it will always find those shortcuts to getting what it wants.
I think it's really useful to see these things as processes as well. So each of those processes, like the monster process, is optimizing itself all the time.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, is it bad that it's optimizing itself?
No, I think it's
I let my
adaptive.
monster optimize itself, and it seems to be the opposite key. Like, society is very much like, eat healthy, do this exercise, do these things that you don't want to do so that you can get the benefit from it. And I've had to take the opposite approach of being lazy, of finding the beauty in that, of finding the shortcuts and finding the solutions there, and then can see how that is its own path. That, like, allowing the monster to have its way makes the monster shut up. If you're conscious while you do it.
It relates to that idea that it's the same machinery that makes us have experience in the world and makes us aware of ourselves is the same machinery that we use for self-deception. So it's like that optimization process or the feedback loop, it works at all levels. So yeah, I don't think it's possible I don't think we can say that it's a bad thing. It's very adaptive. So you're absolutely right. And like, if the monster doesn't get to play at all, then we lose our vitality. And that's kind of the essence of shadow work, where we do need to get in touch with our monster and make sure that it's not like in a cage, not having any expression. Because, well, okay, back to the chakra model, if your energy is all locked up in the root chakra and is not moving up, then you're just going to be lethargic all the time. Like, it needs to release, and it needs to but it needs to release in a way that works with all the other energy centers. So I think that's what you're talking about here.
This still works though from the dog training metaphor, because it's like any dog trainer will tell you, if you don't walk the dog every day, it's going to go nuts and destroy everything in the house, especially the big energetic dogs, which are the ones they're training. They're training the Rottweilers and the Dobermans and those like guard attack type dogs. And if you don't give that dog its daily hour run, it's going to lose its mind. But it also wants the structure that you as the man provide, or is the rational kind of caretaker of it provide. And so it really likes this kind of hierarchical structure because it's a pack animal, and so are we. So it likes to know its place within the pack. And actually the most neurotic dogs are the ones that don't understand their place in the pack. It's when, they could be like stepped over or they step over, and the kind of boundaries of its social relationships are very, very unclear, which you see a lot with like
Small dogs.
Yeah, small dogs. They don't have any clue where they are in the hierarchy, and they tend to assume they're at the top, which is why they get so yippy, So like you want to have an outlet for the monster, but you want it to be in this structured way where the chaos and the destruction are contained and channeled in such a way that it's not pointed back at the owner or at society or at, mates or other dogs or that sort of thing. And the metaphor continues to work perfectly, I think, for humans. It's like if we don't at least give that monster an outlet, it's going to point it at something we love and care about.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big difference for me is that I love the analogy, but in a big way, I am not, I want the structure, but I also know that I am not the dog and there is no trainer. I have to be the trainer and the dog at the same time.
Exactly.
And so the dog goes neurotic when it's not taken for a run and when it doesn't know its place in the pack. I would say most of us don't know our place in the pack because there is no pack and there is no place in the pack. And at the same time, we have to be able to train our own monster, which means that without that trainer there, and society's kind of the trainer of like, is this okay? Is this not okay? Do you get the snossage or do you not get the snossage? And so I've had to take the reverse of like, who is this monster? How do I get to know them? What is it that I'm not letting it do because society has dictated it? And what is it allowed to do? And what is it like supposed to be here to do? And do we have the same monster? Maybe our monster is there because it's supposed to be our shadow side. It's supposed to be what we're here to learn. And it's hard to do that when you're trying to defeat it based on society's standards, which treats them all the same. And they're just bad. Get rid of them. They're bad. They're, the first sin. They fall from grace and it shouldn't be there. And that's our whole process, instead of sitting with it and allowing it and finding the beauty in it. Finding like, how can I harness this monster for my greater good and society's greater good, which I've found to be more useful.
Yeah.
That's the process of sovereignty. And I noticed that actually when he was talking about this process of like the man trains the lion so that the lion can train the monster, and they all come into alignment with each other so that they all have a clear picture of reality, and it reduces ego and self-deception. I was like, well, that's the process of sovereignty to a T. It's the same thing. And shadow work integrated. It's sovereignty and shadow work.
I feel like, is there something, and he didn't bring this up, but he was talking about like how we perceive the future and probabilities and all that stuff. Is there something about the monster that is maybe less able to discern where it is in time? Like if we think of knowing that there are parts of us that are still caught in past traumas, that those parts are monster parts, that it's our rational mind knows where we are in time, but the monster somehow doesn't, it exists differently temporally somehow. And I don't know if he goes into that in future lectures, but I find it interesting.
He did mention that. He said that the monster is concerned with immediate.
Yeah.
The lion is concerned with midterm, and then the man is concerned with long-term abstract goals. So that fits within that model, that the monster doesn't really know where it is in time. It only knows now. I want this now.
Hungry, now.
Horny now.
There's I'm going to bring in a couple of things here that there's a caution with that, of thinking of time linearly in the way that we do, and thinking of it as clock time or annual time. There's also the circular time. Immediacy and circular time gives something. It's noticing that the monster gets its way by paying attention to salience. So the monster can in a sense get sneak in and grab hold of the reins of the reasoning man by making salient. That's what happens when we deal with all spiritual porn and all that. It is a kind of different sort of immediacy, and that the salience is, yes, spiritual attainment. So there's something really interesting in looking at this, not necessarily as just immediacy in terms of clock time, but also in terms of this salient time. What matters to me? What's the thing that is most in front of me? And higher development, the things that are going to be most in front of me are higher development type things. It's also just a little side note. I think it's funny, as I was looking at this, I was thinking, oh, it's interesting that Sesame Street has the Cookie Monster, right? The Cookie Monster is sort of the archetype of that, cookie dough. And in a way, politics aside, Trump is kind of the monster, power now. It's a very much a kind of clear, and I think it's part of what is so disorienting about this moment, is because, wait a minute, hold on a second. Cookie Monster's not supposed to be in the White House. That doesn't make sense from that just shocks us. It's like, how did that happen? I don't understand. And I think that it's sort of but the consequence of that, or the fallout of that, is it really is a deeply affecting wake-up call, right? It does shock us into the fact that we've been slumbering, that we thought that, oh yeah, the monsters are gone, we've solved that. And I think it also, I converted to Judaism, and my rabbi, when the alt-right started taking hold and the neo-Nazi movement started coming up, he's like, I never thought I'd see the day that we had to worry about these things again. Like, it just 10 or 20 years ago, it was inconceivable that we would have to worry about the possibility of ethnic cleansing on a wide scale. And that we're here is like, what? How did that happen? We were so vigilant, right? And I think that wraps back into your point, Mike, it's a comment on one of the things that you said. In some way, I need to be vigilant and have the habit, but I can't rely just on the automaticity of my habits, because that's the way that it sneaks in again.
Yeah, it finds ways every time. Like, they're smart, and you have to be watching. But that's the thing, is the man can outthink the monster, but the monster is always looking for the back door, and but you just have to be vigilant. It's interesting what you were saying about Trump as the monster, because I was thinking, where's the man in this situation? And he's very subservient to the monster in that situation. Like, it's that same thing that happens where we have some emotional reaction to a situation, then we engage the logical mind afterwards to explain what our reaction, and to make it something that we chose to do instead of something we just unconsciously reacted to. And it seems like that's a case. Maybe that would be an interesting thing to talk about when the different kind of levels are in charge and what that looks like.
This idea that the only way to mitigate the monster is to keep constant vigilance. This is actually a super archetypal idea, and the myth of Horus talks about that as well, where it's the eye, which is also the eye at the top of the pyramid, that's where that comes from, is the thing that watches. And if that eye is not there, then all chaos breaks loose. And it's that same thing where, like, we can't compartmentalize the monster, or like what you were saying, just rely on habits or kind of previous understanding, because it always looks for a way in. And the eye is the only way to mitigate it, which means pay attention.
This goes back to our conversation from earlier today about process versus state. And we've been talking about, like, when you done the work. And I won't get into that too much, but basically we arrived at, like, it's all about the process. You have to stick with the process. So you can trust the tools of your process, but you're always going to have to test that they're working and always be watching. So it's not like, I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking of those exact words, state and process, like for half this call, just because it's reminding me of like my meditation practice when like you get that like feeling of center, or just like you feel like, okay, I'm actually meditating, but like the second you stop paying attention, or like it's so easy to get knocked off balance, and then it's just like chaos ensues and everything's like confused again, thoughts just keep coming. But it's like constant diligence is what's required to like maintain that. And it's like I can be constantly diligent for an hour, and it's like for half a second I get that like feeling, or maybe not at all. So it's like, yeah, it's the process. It's not a state. It's never achieved. Like, and it ties in with the Trump thing too. It's like, oh, I never thought I'd see this the day that this happened, because we achieved this state as a society. But it's like, well, we lost the process of maintaining this like higher level society or whatever. So since we dropped the process, the monster creeps back in.
Mm-hmm. This actually also relates to the Jordan Greenhall's idea of simulated thinking, where we've gotten used to thinking a certain way, or we got a certain way of thinking from somewhere else, and we think we got it, we think we understand it, but we actually don't, because we're not doing the process, we're just repeating the same loop over and over that we got from somewhere else, and it might not even be applicable anymore.
There's also, it's also really key to note here that the temptation to think that we finally have it mapped out, I hear that even subtly in our discussion, even as we're talking about it, the thought of, hey, wait a minute, is it the case? Is this the case, or is this the case? It's like neither of those are the case, right? The whole thing is the case, and it just depends on where you are and what's happening. But this being the episode where we're talking about Plato in the cave is really kind of interesting. I've deepened into this thought of, we say, especially in spiritual growth, don't mistake the map for the territory, right? That we know, and yet here's the thing that's a little bit ironic about that. We think what that means is we should only trust the territory and don't trust any maps. The fallacy with that is I've said this before, there isn't any territory. And that I mean that in a very perplexing way. Without maps, there is no territory, or there is only territory, right? There's only the all. The only way that I have the ability to distinguish anything is by maps. And the map that's relevant is the one that's applicable to me right now, not, and in some sense, the chakras are different maps, and the combination of chakras are different maps. The ways in which the monster and the man and the lion dance together are different kinds of maps. And there's not one place that it makes sense. And in this place of meaning crisis collapse, all of the maps get yes.
Yeah, we missed that. Say that all of the maps get what? By the way, David, is it possible you could get closer to your router?
Yeah, I can try that.
Thanks. Yeah, just one more time there.
So I'll just say, all of the maps are both relevant and useless. They actually become like, I need all of them, and none of them are actually going to give me the answer. And this again is process. This is again is I have to actually stay in the present moment about all of this, and can't rely on the historical knowing that I've had in the past.
Man, this relates so much to what I've been learning about programming in scripting. It's like I'm constantly trying to automate all of these processes that I'm doing and write scripts to like cut the time I have to spend on setting up, either the stream or whatever. And there's this funny problem that happens when I've relied on a system so long, I've forgotten how I constructed it because it's become so complex. And it's like I've lost, in some ways, the ability to do it myself anymore because I'm suddenly relying on that thing. And then every once in a while, Windows will update or something else happens on the system and breaks that one of those steps, which breaks the whole system. And suddenly I've got to go back, and because I've relied on this thing the whole time, I've got to go back and fix it. So it's like I simultaneously need to rely on our systems, and we all do rely on the systems that we create, systems of language and society and food, grocery stores, all of that stuff. Like we rely on so many things, but as soon as those things break down, if we don't have the ability to go back and revert to some earlier process, we're screwed, you know?
And I think, at least for me, when I'm switching maps, like I start reading a new author or like I try a new type of meditation or something, I learn a lot, because I'm like breaking my existing frame. Like I used the cutting machinery app as a framework for meditation for like years, and then I actually just switched to using the Sam Harris podcast. And like I was turned off by Sam Harris for a number of reasons years ago, and was just like actively shunning his content. And then I'm coming back to it with a completely different perspective after doing this for a couple of years. And I'm like, whoa! Like the past few weeks have been really interesting, going through that podcast with like a new frame of reference. So that's been really valuable.
Yeah, I've heard I've heard the same thing too. I've had the same attitude about his content and never got back into it.
I have a question related to that, although I actually don't know who Sam Harris is. But that like you can come into content and then go away and come back and it's completely different for you. To me, how much of this journey of sense making is an individual process that nobody else can really judge because it's your process, right? We could have tried to convince you Sam Harris is whatever you got from him. Again, don't know who he is. But like how much is an individual process and how much is a societal or group process that we have to turn to and say, am I doing this right? Is this working right? Versus an internal process or an individual process.
Yeah, good question. I think we all have our own kind of sense making and perception of the world, but then that all of our individual perceptions and sense making add up to the aggregate of all of society, and we need the diversity and variation of perceptions. Like if we all had this homogenous viewpoint, we'd eventually miss something, and viruses and cancer spread that way without the immunity of diversity.
And we're also nested within a cultural context. It's again that point about the lion is like the part that mediates with the rest of society, but it doesn't negate our own internal process and our own internal way of understanding. It's more about bringing them into alignment rather than saying which one is more right.
Which goes back to the importance of the focus on process, not state. It's like state is this idea of what a perfect immune cell looks like, but a perfect immune cell isn't in a state. It's in a constantly shifting, process. It's always updating its definitions of what virus or cancer or whatever equals. And so, yeah.
What's really interesting here is that maps and territory are sort of both a way of referring to a state. And if we can look at maps and territory as being in one sense the same thing, then what it actually is recognize maps and territory are the same, and don't confuse reading and knowing and understanding maps with exploring and understanding territory. Or don't those two processes, the process of propositional understanding and the process of exploration, don't confuse those. That's maybe what is actually meant by don't confuse the maps and the territory, and what's actually the important thing there.
I can't help but think that our ideas of confining, a symbol or an idea into a state, like an ideal thing that you get to, I can't help but think that that's related to the medium of learning, like how we represent thoughts in written, frozen in time symbols, instead of some sort of holographic symbol that contains the element of time as well. And I know we can think this way, but we don't currently have a medium to actually add this into reality. So when we outsource our thinking to or maybe memory is a better way to say that, when we outsource our memory to notepads and docs and that kind of stuff, we freeze that idea in time instead of allowing it the constantly evolving process instead of state. So I wonder if it's not even our fault really that this keeps happening, if it's more just a condition of the way we currently learn and store knowledge.
I think that's a really excellent point. I think you're totally right. It's about what is it, the cognitive software, if you will, of symbolic thinking, that a symbol is a thing and it's locked in, and in order to transmit that thing to another person, we have to have it locked in. Even words, you know, they mean this thing and not another thing. And maybe what was it, that movie, what is it, Arrival, where these aliens use language in a different way?
Yeah, it's Arrival.
That isn't
Oh
locked
yeah,
in
that's
time.
perfect for this. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe that's kind of the next stage of human cognitive development, is that we create some sort of
medium of holographic communication.
Transmuting knowledge that isn't locked into a static symbol.
Absolutely. The sense of being able to interact digitally and holographically, so that relevance realization is both communal and personal, right? We all sense what we all need to sense collectively, but I am able to zoom in and focus on whatever element I need to and filter out what's not specifically relevant to me in this moment. You know, the sense that there is some staticness to factual knowledge, right, is the fallacy. And I'm also really intrigued by looking at science over time and watching the way that that's unfolded. You know, that Newton had one particular way of noticing relationships, but missed the part of relativity that Einstein found. But even when Einstein proposed relativity, he thought of the universe as basically static. I mean, again, we go back to the idea there's something. It's like we attach to this something. It's kind of it's interesting to notice the desire, like something in the way that we conceive of truth is that it is everlasting and static. And we keep discovering, no, that's not the case. It continues to dissolve into process, into participatory knowing rather than propositional knowing as a final state.
But again, I think that's really a part of the medium, because we can all think of a soccer player. You know, what does a soccer player look like? And any of the six of us might imagine that soccer player in a different position on the field, kicking the ball or stopping the ball, or in a defensive maneuver or an offensive maneuver. Like, we've got all these different versions of what a soccer player is, but you could take the aggregate of all of our ideas and all the angles through which we could recognize what a soccer player is. Inside and out of time, we could see a moving object, we can see a snapshot of it, and that all is represented by the holographic symbol soccer player, right? So I really feel like this idea that we have this desire to see things fit into finite, singular, binary, symbolic terms, like we have the answer, can actually that can actually work if we expanded the way we think about things in the mediums that we're using to kind of represent the same way we think, because that is the way we think. Like, we're brilliant in that way, humans are, but computers are total shit at this. They can't recognize. That's why it's so difficult to train computers to actually recognize images, different angles of cats and stuff, because they don't think in the way that we do. But we notate all of our knowledge and externalize all of our knowledge to that medium. So I really feel like if we expanded the way we think about that to the hologram instead of the 2D symbol, we could actually fit knowing. I mean, that's just a theory I've just came up with right now, but I think I'd like to maybe test ways in which that would be incorrect. Because it's kind of infinitely expandable, isn't it? Like, you update your definitions constantly if you're thinking in holographic terms. It's like, what is a soccer player? Well, if a soccer player is like dressed as a clown, suddenly a soccer player dressed as a clown becomes your updated addition to that holographic model, you know?
I think a piece of, not where it falls apart, but where we have a problem as society, is that we're not looking at it in that way. We're not looking at, like, yes, we all have an idea of the soccer player, and it's the aggregate of that is the soccer player. It's not my piece, it's our piece Instead, we're arguing what is a soccer player, right? No, they're in red. They're in red. They're absolutely in red. They can't not be in red. They're not a soccer player, even though that's not what is fundamentally a soccer player.
Yeah.
It is that they can be in any color of jersey, be any type of human, be like,
could even be a dog.
Taking a step back and being like, well, what aren't we arguing about, right? Because we're so in the debate and so in this position of like, you know, arguing the elephant where we're all holding different pieces of it without realizing, right, we're all in different spaces. We all have a different sense making in that moment. And even if it doesn't make sense to you right now, it might never, and that might be exactly where you need to be. Like, allowing for the individual process, allowing for, yes, and you might not know what a soccer player is, right? How do you come into this and not knowing what one is and get an idea when you don't have a vision in your head because you've never heard of soccer?
What's interesting about the holographic symbol is that you can deconstruct it from almost every single property. Like you could make it not a human, you could make a ball you could make it a square, you know, you could change the look of the goalpost, you could make it on the moon, like any number of things, and you could still I'm sure there's a level where you would abstract it to not being soccer, but like you can have so many different variables that don't count and still call it the same thing.
Is this a bit like what Vervaeke was talking about when he's talking about understanding what a bird is?
Yeah, the structural
right? There's
functional
some
organization.
logos to what that is, and that's central to it, but you can't rationally pinpoint it.
Right, and actually that goes back to his notion that it's participatory, right? It's mind, and it's the man and the monster and the lion all working together to make sense of it in logos, not any one of them. And I think you're right, Mike. I think that the notion that we see things more in a fixed way is it's both a consequence, and it's a consequence of the tools that we're using, and the tools obviously shape the way that we think about it, right? So it is this developmental thing where this is what John Vervaeke, this is one of the reasons that I really love this lecture series and wanted to get into discussing this, because he deconstructs the process of building psychotechnologies in a way that moves us away from arguing about what's right about the psychotechnologies and really what's more effective about the psychotechnologies. It really is, you start to see the organs of thought more than the results of thought. And that really allows me to back up and recombine them in different ways. I truly can become an alchemist in my own individual and collective development by noticing what the ingredients are. It's actually saying that, I'm kind of blown away that it's perfectly timed for where we are. I'd also say there's something, I just really read, Stuart Russell is an AI researcher who just recently wrote a book called Human Compatible, about he sort of got frustrated with the way in which the apocalyptic view on AI and the utopian view on AI were talking past each other. It's like, wait a minute, there really are issues, but we're not getting to it by this either or kind of view of it. We really need to look at how do we actually make AI participatory? That's the essence of what he's looking at. And when I look at that and notice to the degree to which practice has stopped being part of our daily lives and for human beings, that we have lost track of the participatory aspect of knowing. And when we strive towards artificial intelligence and computers, we start with the propositional knowing and then learn, okay, propositional knowing fails when we don't have perspectival knowing. Okay, perspectival and propositional work, but now we're missing the perceptual. Now we've got all of those, but we're missing the participatory. So we're sort of reverse engineering from top to bottom the process of knowing by rediscovering that our participatory knowing is at the root of it. It's the subconscious part that we take for granted. You know, we think, oh, well, babies can see, so it must be non-trivial, or it must be trivial. It's like, oh, actually, no, language and recognition of objects and all of that most fundamental participatory bootstrap code that we have is incredibly complicated and hard to see because it's so rooted in how we make sense.
I really see this being a very important direction in the future for future generations. This ability to be, and it's also interesting. I'll finish the thought. The ability to create complex, evolving algorithms, or holographic ideas, like, you know, externalize our thought, because that's what we need to do to grow and share knowledge as a species. We need to figure out how to externalize it, but not have it contained as a snapshot in time. And it really makes me think that this is like the next level of communication, and how, you know how John Vervaeke talks about how culture influences thought in kind of our cognitive operating systems, which then influences culture, and then it's this recursive thing. Like that's his whole thing about how
Agent and arena.
The Christianity being such an important proponent of how we think. And when you were talking about, well, really what I want to say is it seems like we've become more like the computers we've been designing, you know, in that kind of logical, clear-cut, binary way of thinking. Like, we need things to make sense, because computers won't work if things don't make sense. And we haven't figured out that participatory kind of programming language to be able to do this. But to me, like, I can see it happening out there. Like, that is happening. That's with evolving AI algorithms. That's with, I mean, you can create something in your basement. You can do that right now. It's just not part of the common language. And I think that's an important thing. That's something I really want to think about, and how I want to, you know, educate my kids.
There's also, it's interesting, you know, that I pay attention to kind of a broad range of topics that tie together here. One of them is the cognitive scientists, and I've mentioned Donald Hoffman before in The Case Against Reality. So that's one of the domains of really looking and saying, everything we experience is just user interface. And this kind of goes back to there is no territory. It's all maps. But that's one thing that shows up. The other one that shows up that's really interesting is Leonard Susskind, the physicist, I've been looking more at some of his discussion of the universe as a hologram, and the notion of his view of it has to do with where relativity and quantum mechanics sort of break down or conflict. And it was an argument that he and several other physicists had with Stephen Hawking about whether information was destroyed when something fell into a black hole. This is a little bit abstract, but the notion that once something falls into a black hole, its uniqueness has fallen apart, and everything that in the black hole is non-distinct anymore, and it's lost any distinguishment. And just the principle of that, everybody who really works in quantum mechanics is like, Stephen, that's not possible. It violates so much of what we know. Information isn't destroyable. And it's really kind of almost too much to wrap my head around, but there's something in the notion of it that even at the fundamental function of the universe, it is holographic. It is participatory in this it's participatory and propositional all at the same time. It's information and experience. And you really can't separate them. You can favor one over the other, but you can't separate one over the other.
That relates to so many things. First of all is the double slit experiment. You know, that observing something fundamentally changes its structure, and so the observer is inseparable from the thing being observed. And this also relates to a lot of what is talked about in the meditation traditions, that at a certain point that realization comes that you just cannot, you can experience kind of having this like impartial observer, but then if that observer tries to look back at itself, there's actually nothing there. So it's still some sort of a process, like it's a function. So when the function tries to observe itself, there's nothing there. So you can't separate it. You can't separate the thing observing from the thing being observed.
I can't help but go back to the programming thing and think about, the metaphors. Programming is the metaphor for what we're going through. It's like we have these processes and functions that are supposed to update our variables, which are the kind of the output or the input. It's the ideas that we have that are kind of like states. But the process updates those variables, but we don't seem to have a process to update the process, at least in our kind of cultural operating system. Like the process is broken because it's producing outcomes that we no longer want anymore. But we don't have a further process to optimize the process. Like there's not that third party thing.
This is where I'm so intrigued with holochain. And it's so few people really know what holochain is. It's an alternative to the blockchain, but it is holographic. It really is flipping the paradigm, and it's no longer data centric, which is what's the one universal thing that we're all writing out there, right? It's not fact based, it's agent based, it's agent centric. So each person is recording their own individual hash table about what their experience is, and the overlap is collectively reinforced as it's going through. That process, when developers are working in that paradigm, watching their mental process flip and seeing that, you can see it. I mean, they're ready now to as they're developing, they can see, what I thought was the core is the consensual correctness is emergent. What is core is my individual personal experience in this moment as I'm experiencing and using the data, and what am I recording and seeing and perceiving and hypothesizing, and that collectively emerges into something else, which is I don't know how much holochain will be able to do that, but that is the kind of future technology that will allow us to really think holographically. And the people who are working in that are starting to get an early view into what that kind of holographic thought has, or what kind of impact that holographic thinking has.
And tying it back to some of John Vervaeke's recent lectures, I think he's been talking to Jordan Hall a bit recently, and this idea emerged out of their conversations about like meta psychotechnologies. So like we have these inherited psychotechnologies that are kind of like the functions that just exist, but now we seem to be like able to consciously think about how we like what psychotechnologies we need and like develop these psychotechnologies in ways that like actually promote the outcomes that we want to see, or just like foster growth. So yeah, I mean, it's like a recursive function, but we are like watching this recursive function iterate and develop and evolve in new ways. So yeah, it's a interesting idea.
In many ways, a lot of that was discovered very early on. I mean, a lot of that is reflected in shamanism, where it's a thing. It's kind of a discipline of like breaking frame and creating something new rather than just like relying on existing systems. Like the shaman is going out into the unknown and interacting with whatever he finds there. I'm not explaining this well, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not relying on existing psychotechnologies, but it's a method of creating psychotechnologies. And it's very participatory and very first person.
Right.
Yeah, which is why it's so difficult to put it into words.
It is also, the sense in which we can interact in that sort of meta frame where we're sort of deriving the psychotechnologies on the fly as we need them in order to accomplish what it is we're doing individually and together is really powerful. I mean, it is. So just looking at this, right? Noticing so far that what Vervaeke is doing by reviewing this, beginning with the Greeks and really kind of going back to the Bronze Age collapse, is the power of psychotechnology to shape the way that we think, and noticing that each of the psychotechnologies is incredibly powerful, but it takes a while at the old days for the impact to permeate through the rest of culture. But then culture reinstalls that software into the young to run on until it needs another upgrade, and then that upgrade happens. Then we get the writing, and then the printing press, and then the mass media, and then it's starting to accelerate as we're doing it, and we're really real time coming to the point that it's not the psychotechnologies that aren't just what is installed by culture, but culture is real time inventing the psychotechnologies. I mean, we're able now with a worldwide internet to create and distribute this cultural influence on the fly. Anyone who's relying very heavily on a very static notion of narrative has a very difficult time updating their psychotechnologies real time enough to stay abreast of what's happening. But the millennials really are. They're like starting to resonate with the present moment in a practical way that has psychotechnologies emerge right as they're needed. Yeah.
I mean, all the memes is one example.
Yeah, I was thinking memes too. Yeah.
You create memes in a way that they're like daemons, they're like automated kind of semi-conscious processes that do something in response to something else.
Yeah. And if you're not tapped into the narrative, they don't make sense at all.
Yeah. And they also come and go with time.
Yeah.
They only arise as needed.
Guys, I think we should probably wrap up pretty quick. If you guys have any last comments or anything, now's the time. Or any comments from the chat as well.
Nope. Just want to say thank you guys for doing this, because it's really refreshing. I really enjoy these, so I just want to express my appreciation.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Invite your friends next time.
All right. Cool. Well, let's wrap this up, and we do this every Monday. I have to get the time zones right.
At 9 a.m. Pacific or 5 p.m. GMT. So, and then the discussion is an hour later.
Everyone's welcome.
Everyone's welcome. The discussion, we do have limited spots, but so far we haven't had the problem of overcrowding. Yeah, and it's going to be at our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/futurethinkers, and then the fresh streaming link will be posted usually in the 24 hours to 12 hours before the stream goes live.
Yep. Cool. Thanks, guys. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.